Hello again. Enoch Powell was one of the greatest politicians we have ever seen in this country. He was a ferociously intelligent man, becoming the youngest professor in the British Empire at the age of just 25. He became a soldier and rose to the rank of brigadier before entering Parliament. How different, how very different from the current crop of MPs that we see in the House. Powell was also possessed of a burning passion for justice, and it was this which perhaps hindered his advancement up the so-called slippery pole. By the mid-1950s, when he was in his early 40s, Enoch Powell was a rising star in the Conservative Party. He had been appointed Junior Housing Minister in 1955, and then in 1957 became Financial Secretary to the Treasury. It looked as though he was destined for great things, until he made a speech in 1959 which caused many Conservative MPs to view him with extreme disfavour. Britain was during the 1950s fighting a savage war in Kenya against the guerrillas popularly known today as the Mau Mau. There were many executions, and the British Army set up concentration camps to contain the insurgents. At one of these camps, Hola, there occurred in the spring of 1959 a terrible massacre. Those detained were expected to undertake heavy labour, and they resolved upon a peaceful and passive protest. They decided simply to refuse to pick up the spades and pickaxes needed for their work. On the morning of Tuesday, 3rd of March 1959, the men being held at Hola were paraded and ordered to pick up spades and picks and get ready to march a mile to the place where they were supposed to be digging an irrigation ditch. The camp commandant made it perfectly clear that there were apt to be disagreeable consequences for those who disobeyed orders that day. Some of the men decided to comply and set off to work. 88 of them simply sat down and refused to move. Sullivan, the commander of the camp, now put into action a plan which was not of his own devising, but had been formulated and approved by his superiors. The senior superintendent of prisons in Nairobi had visited Hola a few weeks previously and come up with a plan which was to become infamous. If any prisoner refused to obey the order to work, then the instructions for the commander and his men were written down in black and white as follows: It is assumed that the party would obey this order, but if they refused, they were to be manhandled to the site of work and forced to carry out the task. Any normal person reading this instruction would certainly believe that he had been given carte blanche to use physical force on the prisoners. When the order to pick up their tools and start marching to work had been ignored a second time, the order was given to the guards to start beating the recalcitrant prisoners. By the time the guards had finished laying about them with pickaxe handles and other weapons, 11 men had been beaten to death. The remainder were badly injured. Almost as soon as the massacre had taken place, attempts were made to cover up what had been done. One white man who appeared on the scene a short while later and found 11 corpses laying in a heap asked what had happened to them. The explanation was perhaps not as plausible as could have been hoped. He was told that the men had been overcome by the heat, had quarrelled and fought each other, and then fainted. Water had then been thrown over them to try and revive them, but this had resulted in all of them being drowned. Even in a society used to turning a blind eye to the mistreatment of black Africans, the murders at the Hola camp were too much. Word leaked out and questions began to be asked in London. It was still hoped to keep secret what had happened to the men who had been victims of the massacre in the Hola concentration camp. The official version still involved water, but now it was being claimed that the 11 men had died after drinking contaminated water and had somehow been poisoned by it. It was hinted that their own poor standards of hygiene had contributed to their deaths. Unfortunately for the guilty parties concerned, too many witnesses existed for the matter to be hushed up indefinitely. It was not long before the first newspapers, and then members of Parliament, were in full possession of the facts. There was, however, a tacit agreement among MPs not to raise the subject in the House. One MP in particular fought hard to prevent the matter being forgotten or suppressed. He refused to join the conspiracy of silence, and on the 27th of July, 1959, the member for Wolverhampton made a rousing, passionate speech on the subject of the deaths at Hola Camp. His oration was all the more effective for being made by a former minister of the government then in power. He was outraged at the thoughts that such a dreadful crime might be brushed under the carpet or be made light of. He said in his speech, "We cannot say we will have African standards in Africa, Asian standards in Asia, and perhaps British standards here at home. We have not that choice to make. We must be consistent with ourselves everywhere. All government, all influence of man upon man rests on opinion. What we can do in Africa, where we can still govern and where we no longer govern, depends upon the opinion which is entertained of the way in which this country acts and the way in which Englishmen act. We cannot, we dare not, in Africa of all places, fall below our highest standards in the acceptance of responsibility." This speech was widely thought to have been a masterpiece of parliamentary rhetoric, and it prevented Enoch Powell ever being given another government post. It is, to say the least, a bit ironic that this, his most memorable speech, the one generally recognised to be the best speech he ever gave in his life, was delivered in defence of black Africans, and that by his fierce determination not to ignore the plight of these victims, he thus effectively ended his political career.